here tonight to introduce Gabriel and tell you a little bit about him. So Gabriel is a poet journalist, an award-winning foreign correspondent. He's lived and worked throughout the Middle East, the Balkans, and East Africa. He was awarded an honorary doctorate in recognition of his work as a journalist by the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at UC Berkeley in 2017 and by Lancaster University in the UK in 2022. He currently serves as the executive director of the historic Ruskin Art Club, as Tyson has just told you, and he's lectured widely on Ruskinian themes, including giving a talk at Notre Dame in 2022 on Ruskin and ecology. He's a companion of the Guild of St. George, a charity founded by Ruskin in 1871. He is our indomitable leader at the Ruskin Art Club, who has expanded the work of the club and the programming of the club immensely, and we're all very grateful to him for that and for stewarding our work here tonight. So welcome, Gabriel.
To make sure I'm wired. I think I am. Is this working? It is now. Okay, can everyone hear me? All right, very good. Well, Tyson said that this was my brainchild. Actually, I have a partner in crime who just introduced me. So, as Sarah said, we've been working on this for a very long time and are delighted to welcome everyone tonight to this. And the historic Ruskin Art Club of Los Angeles is also delighted to co-sponsor this event with our friends at the Doheny Library of USC and also our friends at the Dynamic Telescope Studio. So this is functioning as a keynote address. The title of the talk is Ruskin and the California Dream. And while the focus is on the surprising breadth of Ruskin's influence on late 19th and early 20th century California and on the development of the modern myth of California, I'm also going to touch very lightly on Ruskin's broader influence on American life, the topic of our conference, which other presenters will be developing in much greater detail and much greater depth for us tomorrow. This, as befits a keynote address, is the overture. The California dream, like most dreams, finds its origin in a nightmare. One doesn't have to dig very deeply in the literature about the settling of the American West to pick up the redemptive strain. The California dream, a dream of ubiquitous opportunities, endless summers, and fresh starts, may have begun in James Marshall's 1848 discovery of a gold nugget in John Sutter's sawmill and the onset of the gold rush. But it found its true raison d'etre in the national longing for rejuvenation and renewal that emerged in the wake of the Civil War. I'm indebted to my friend, the distinguished historian William Devereux, for this insight and for the often neglected connections between the fratricide of America's greatest tragedy and the lure of the pristine and uncontaminated West. Devereux, who serves as the director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, has laid out this thesis in a number of essays and books, including most recently his book, To Bind Up the Nation's Wounds, The American West After the Civil War. But he also, with Devereux, fascinated us more than 10 years ago with a lecture to the Ruskin Art Club on this topic, on the factors that led the founders of the Ruskin Art Club to Los Angeles in the late 1880s. As Devereux writes in a 2007 essay entitled Redemptive California, Rethinking the Post-Civil War, quote, Americans, Northerner and Southerner alike, moved west in the post-war era in part because of the Civil War, because they wanted to get away, because they wanted to heal physically, emotionally, or otherwise. And most of them came on the Transcontinental Railroad, which was, if anything, a device by which the nation was supposed to be drawn together after the war, a gigantic suture tying the torn asunder north and south. That railroads served as the catalyst of the dream should come as no surprise. What is remarkable, and germane to our discussion tonight, is the language that politicians and preachers used to describe the meeting of the rails. "Hail then, all hail," an orator exclaimed at the Central Pacific Railroad groundbreaking in Sacramento in 1863. "This auspicious hour, hail this bond of brotherhood and union, hail this marriage between the Atlantic and the Pacific, hail, all hail this bow of promise, the symbol, the harbinger, the pledge of a higher civilization and an ultimate and worldwide peace." A preacher took this even further in his remark that with the railroad, the new Jerusalem is coming down from heaven and will switch off in Oakland. In popular culture, the lure of California as a land of millennial dreams was aptly caricatured in W.C. Fields' classic 1934 comedy, It's a Gift, in my view, the best of the Fields films. The plot, if plot is the word I want, centers on the hapless Harold Bissonnet, who insists on pronouncing his name Bissonnet, at least when his wife is present, shades of hyacinth bouquet, a struggling New Jersey grocer who has his heart set on buying a California orange ranch and living a sunshine-filled life of ease. After 1,000 vexations, as only W.C. Fields can be vexed, he finally achieves his aim, and the final scene finds him alone and out of doors, effortlessly plucking an orange from an overhanging branch, squeezing a little juice in a glass before he adds something much stronger from his flask, a look of triumphant self-satisfaction on his face. While the California dream has many components, once the rails made it feasible, people came to California seeking health, especially for pulmonary ailments, or adventure or freedom to pursue one's own version of happiness. But we miss much if we fail to underline the redemptive character of many of these hopes, the pledge of a higher civilization, because these redemptive hopes would prove fertile ground for the idealistic movements and dreams of social reinvention that would come to characterize the California of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and play a not inconsiderable role even today in the idea of California as a place of social and artistic experiment. While we can cite many influences on pre-World War I California's array of social and religious movements, John Ruskin holds an honorable and often neglected place among these influences. In a few cases, Ruskin has a direct influence, but on many more, the influence was more diffuse, as a thinker whose books, or at least quotations from them, were widely cited, whose ideas were in the air. Before we describe a few of the ways Ruskin influenced aspects of the California dream and Ruskin's impact on Southern California in particular, it's helpful to consider Ruskin's broader impact on 19th century America. Given the constraints of time, this can only hope to be a cursory sketch, and we'll be exploring all this again in much richer depth tomorrow. For someone who never set foot on these shores, the formidable influence Ruskin wielded on American artists and thinkers in the 19th century is both remarkable and remarkably underreported. The bicentennial celebrations in 2019 went some distance in correcting that neglect. Among other events, I'm thinking of the exhibition, The American Pre-Raphaelites, Radical Realists, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which featured the work of a large and important group of artists, architects, and scientists coalesced around the journal The New Path, who tried to realize a specifically Ruskinian vision in mid-19th century America. The New Path, of course, with its reminiscences of William Morris. I have much to thank America for, Ruskin wrote in an open letter published in 1855 in The Crayon, the first American arts journal run by William J. Stillman, one of Ruskin's early American disciples. America had given him, Ruskin went on, a heartier appreciation than I have ever met in England. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than the thought of being of use to an American. And if I can, in my way, oblige any Americans who are interested in art, I beg that you will call on me. This despite the serious reservations, if not positive disdain, Ruskin routinely expressed in his writings on the subject of America's political institutions and democratic ideals. I can't resist mentioning in this context a quote from a letter Ruskin wrote to his friend and confidant, Charles Eliot Norton, the legendary professor of the history of art at Harvard, about his American expatriate friends, the Alexanders, who had settled in Florence. Ruskin told Norton clearly in a teasing panic that he had actually been obliged to run away from Florence, and the two precious American women there, Mrs. and Miss Alexander, lest I should be converted into an American citizen. Francesca Alexander, the Miss Alexander, went on to dedicate herself to an intense fusion of drawing and text in handmade books that made her one of the most original of Ruskin's American disciples. We should also note in this connection that a significant number of the American artists who modeled themselves after aspects of Ruskin's aesthetic program and with his encouragement were women. I am thinking here particularly of Fidelia Bridges. There she is in one of her wonderful sketches in watercolors. Move to the next one. Yeah. Fidelia Bridges. Part of Ruskin's impact can be traced to the parade of influential American artists and intellectuals who visited the Victorian master on his home turf and on the continent, and those American artists who actually studied under Ruskin. We've mentioned Norton, and there was what we might call the Norton Circle. Artists such as Charles Herbert Moore, who studied drawing under Ruskin in the 1870s and was later director of the Fogg Museum, and the group of American Ruskinians who painted in Italy: Moore, Henry Newman, Harold Broadfield Warren, Denman Ross, and Joseph Lyndon Smith. Many of these American Ruskinians later assumed positions of leadership in American art institutes, particularly the influential nexus of Harvard, the Fogg Museum, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and in the formation of arts curricula in American universities. They helped to popularize Ruskin's perspectives on what I like to call precision seeing, and the approach to drawing elucidated in his 1857 masterpiece, The Elements of Drawing, and later, The Elements of Perspective, for generations of American art students. Norton's colleague, Harold Warren, championed Ruskin's theories at the Harvard School of Architecture well into the 20th century until his long tenure ended in 1930. The enthusiasm of these Americans under Ruskin's tutelage may be gauged from a letter Moore wrote to Norton in 1876. To come here directly and be driven as I was in Mr. Ruskin's carriage to Rydal Mount on the second day, and was a truly delightful introduction to dear old England. Mr. Ruskin spent the 2 mornings in giving me the most invaluable instruction, drawing for me with his own hand and giving me precisely the help that I have all my life been longing for. Echoing a famous remark by Charlotte Bronte, Moore wrote simply that, by the mercy of God, Ruskin has been sent to open our eyes and loose the seals of darkness. It should be noted that while few of the artists associated with Ruskin's American circle attained anything like commercial success, American architectural acolytes fared much better in the public arena. I'm thinking here of architects such as Peter Bonnet White, who built Yale University's Street Hall in 1867 along strictly Ruskinian lines, using local stone and builder craftsmen, and in his even more influential Gothic Revival National Academy of Design in New York. Let me suggest a particularly striking example of the work of these American artistic pilgrims to Ruskin, a 1903 bronze portrait of John Ruskin by the American sculptor Gutzon Borglum of Mount Rushmore fame. The bronze shows a seated Ruskin in his great coat with a heavy lap robe over his legs, with one hand resting on a book, as one contemporary critic put it, in monumental repose. According to Judith Tolnick, the pensive pose of the subject is remarkably similar to those of ancient Greek figures of philosophers who hold scrolls in one hand and support their usually bearded chins with the other. In Borglum's day, the ancient pose was often employed to depict famous figures in the fine arts. The statuette is based on sketches Borglum did from life in the late 1890s. The young Borglum, who had studied painting initially with California Impressionist painter William Keith in the 1880s, went to Europe with his wife in 1889 and enrolled in the Académie Julienne in Paris and switched while there from painting to sculpture. Like so many other American sculptors, he fell under the influence of Rodin, as the bronze amply demonstrates. Borglum was introduced to Ruskin by the organist H.S. Roberts and invited by Roberts to visit Ruskin at his estate in the Lake District at Brentwood, probably in 1897, just 3 years before Ruskin's death in 1900. Quote, while Ruskin and Roberts talked, Borglum studied Ruskin and made several sketches of him. He found that Ruskin had drawn into himself. He knew his worth. He had full confidence in his own strength, but he was sad. The most marvelous, magnificent, unappreciated genius the world has ever known. Deeply impressed, Borglum told his wife, as soon as I have time, I will make a statue of Ruskin. Borglum returned to the United States in 1902, now separated from his wife, Elizabeth Janes, returned to LA, eventually relocating to Venice, California, where she continued to paint and where she became a member of the Ruskin Art Club. She donated a pastoral scene signed Elizabeth Borglum to our collection, a painting which we still own. Borglum cast his Ruskin statue for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where he won a gold medal for his early bronze, The Mares of Diomedes. Why did Ruskin's aesthetic perspectives meet with such a fervent response in mid-19th century America? Well, we can't do justice to that large topic in the few minutes we have this evening, but let me suggest two broad stroke reasons. As America emerged as an independent power in the world after the Civil War, questions naturally arose about the shape of American as opposed to European art. From the beginning of his career as an art critic, Ruskin, in his support of Turner, had attacked the straitjacket of the Academy and conventional academic standards in landscape painting. Ruskin thought that the root of art lay in the ability of the individual artist to see and engage the real world and to find there, and not in historically approved models, the sources of truth. as Ruskin famously exhorted young artists in his first masterpiece, Modern Painters, in a very famous passage. Go to nature in all singleness of heart and walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thought but how to best penetrate her meaning and remember her instructions, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, rejoicing always in the truth. Beyond strictly aesthetic concerns, Ruskin's idea that art is essentially connected to social improvement and to human development, not some rarefied pastime for elites, a connection central to Ruskin's thought, was deeply attractive to American interests and mores. As John Parks notes in a 2007 article on the artists of the Norton Circle, quote, "This was the magic brew that Ruskin concocted and that American artists found utterly intoxicating." And he would never forgive us if we failed to mention Oscar Wilde as a source of the spread of Ruskin's ideas in the 19th century. In 1882, Wilde came to America on his famous lecture tour, which served to bring some of Ruskin's concepts filtered through Wilde's very different sensibility to enthusiastic, if somewhat bewildered, popular audiences from coast to coast. Wilde, of course, had been a student of Ruskin's at Oxford. He was even part of Ruskin's diggers' brigades at the Hinksey Road project near Oxford in the 1870s, where they did road building and a little slum clearance. One would pay anything for a photograph of Oscar Wilde in the diggers' brigades. The tour, the Wilde tour, as you know, was inspired by the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta Patience, in which Wilde as Reginald Bunthorne and the then young aesthetic movement were roundly mocked. Never one to ignore publicity in any form, Wilde agreed to do the rigorous American lecture tour as part of a scheme to boost ticket sales for the operetta's run in the US. In the year-long tour, which included 2 tours of Canada, Wilde gave more than 140 lectures to audiences large and small, including miners in Leadville, Colorado. His first and most substantial lecture, The English Renaissance in Art, is not only heavily indebted to his former teacher, but some of it, at least, is lifted verbatim from Ruskin, as Robert Hewison confirmed in a visit in 2019 to the William Clark Library in Los Angeles to check the manuscript of Wilde's lecture notes. Here, it would not be out of place to recommend Hewison's essay on Ruskin and Wilde, really a splendid piece of work in his 2018 study, Ruskin and His Contemporaries. This brings us inevitably to the other pole of Ruskin's impact on American society, namely on the creation of craft-based and utopian communities. 3 bullet point examples. There were dozens of such experiments around the turn of the 20th century, most short-lived, lasting a year or two. But what should be noted is that most, if not all, of these American attempts had their roots in the example of the agrarian-based activities of the Guild of St. George that Ruskin had founded in the 1870s, and in the craft enterprises inspired by William Morris. In California, this mainly took the form of back to the land movements. For example, there are the early settlers of the Little Lands colony in Tujunga. The colony was the brainchild of William Smythe, who had organized colonies of gardeners and small farmers in other parts of the state with the slogan, "A little land and a living." Bolton Hall in Tujunga, the community's 1913 rock-faced meeting house, is one of the few physical remnants of the Little Lands colony today. Members of the cooperative community, around 200 at its height, were urged to build their houses, plant some seed, get some goats and chickens and pigeons, and sit back and enjoy life. Shades of W.C. Fields without the oranges. This agrarian revival, what Smythe called the next passion of mankind, a passion for the soil, played into the popular ideas of the time, ideas embraced by the state's publicists that California would spearhead a return of the middle class to the land. The urban bondage, so the argument ran, had run its course, and a new way of life was possible in which modern scientific men and women could embrace the benefits of country life and resist the evils of industrialization. Most of these attempts, I know you'll find this as no surprise, foundered on one stubborn fact or another. With the Little Landers, it was the most stubborn fact of all. It was rocks. After clearing stones from the valley floor and building their houses, colonists found themselves without ice, without gas to cook with, or mail delivery. While livestock sickened, gophers and lizards thrived. Beneath the rocks were more rocks, and then more rocks. And many simply decided that the promise of the good life was just too hard. In Ruskin, Florida, educators experimented with new and very Ruskinian models of higher education, drawn particularly from Ruskin's years as Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford. And in Ruskin, Tennessee, with a nod to Morris, more equitable relations between capital and labor. Ruskin, Florida, in the western part of the state, was developed in 1908 by two educators, Dr. George Miller and his wife, Addie. In 1910, the Ruskin Common Good Society, I love that name, the Ruskin Common Good Society officially incorporated the town, and the Millers presided over the Ruskin College there, which required students to do manual labor part-time in order to pay for their education and housing. However, by 1918, World War I had decimated most of the student body, and a disastrous fire finished the job, destroying the campus that same year. Miller died in 1919, and although the town survived as a farming community, the idealistic dreams of its founders did not. Ruskin, Tennessee had an even shorter and more dramatic trajectory. Founded by crusading newspaper editor and socialist reformer Julius Wayland in 1894, the Ruskin colony, or more properly, Commonwealth, was one of the many attempts to create model societies in rural areas which would challenge and provide a practical alternative to the American industrial system. Such colonies also functioned as an implicit criticism of the limitations of social reform based on urban models and institutions such as organized labor. That Ruskin was the direct inspiration of Wayland's efforts, as is made clear in the vigorous editorials he wrote for his newspaper, The Coming Nation. Quote, "How few people who have seen in print those two words, John Ruskin, have any conception of the great, loving, wise spirit they stand for. If they only did know, what a world of happiness that would be. But those who have studied Ruskin can see an echo of his writing in all these columns, for his mind is my inspiration." End quote. Interestingly, Ruskin, though frail and beset by illness, returned the compliment. He gifted the Tennessee Commonwealth, named after him, a set of his works, including, appropriately enough, an autographed copy of For's Clavigera, his letters to the working men of England. These are some photographs of the strawberry pickers and the Ruskin a cooperative currency instead of money. Despite the master's interest, Ruskin Tennessee lasted just 2 years before being torn apart by disputes about governance and free love, in no particular order. The monogamous majority moved to Georgia in 1896 to start anew, but disease, failed business enterprises, and poverty forced them to disband in 1901. Of all these attempts, the most substantial and durable in its aims and long-lasting effects was and is the Roycroft community in East Aurora, New York. Founded in 1895 by the colorful former soap salesman, publicist, and self-styled philosopher Elbert Hubbard, on the basis of visits to Ruskin and Morris, the Roycroft Guild, initially organized around printing and fine press publishing, soon grew into a residential community of artisans, printers, furniture makers, metalsmiths, leather workers, and bookbinders that made a notable mark on the development of American architecture and on book and interior design at the turn of the 20th century. It's Elbert, classic, Roycroft, book design, and these special editions, often of Elbert's works, that have just remarkable printing features. At its height in 1910, the community boasted a population of 500, and contrary to the examples of other communities that we've cited, Roycroft, in one form or another, has managed to persevere both as a colony and as a style, despite the loss of Hubbard, who, in a moment of prophetic insight and not a little hubris, imagining that he could personally persuade Kaiser Wilhelm to end the war, booked himself and his wife on the Lusitania in May 1915. It's especially gratifying to witness the recent revival of the Roycroft Press under the leadership of Joe Weber, who has made every effort to create new books in the classic Roycroft style and has even managed to locate and to press into service 4 of Hubbard's own printing presses. Back to California. It's October 12th, 1888. We are in the living room of Mary Boyce's house, just off Pershing Square in downtown Los Angeles. The Los Angeles of 1888, a brash city in the midst of epoch-making transitions. In 1880, the population of the city of Los Angeles was a little over 11,000. By 1890, it was more than 50,000. By the turn of the century, that figure had doubled. As California historian Kevin Starr perceptively notes, quote, "Hope for the good life glowed white hot in the 1880s when thousands upon thousands of Pullman immigrants poured into the state in the most dramatic population growth since the gold rush. Their lives were explorations at a time of transition. Together they glimpsed an idea which yet remains a challenge and which might become a tragic irony. They dreamed of a California of nature and art, lived with dignity and celebrated in creativity. They wanted a California of health, color, warmth, and heritage. They struggled for it, all of them, even the wounded ones." End quote. It's very much in this context and in this spirit that the Ruskin Art Club was born. Captain Henry H. Boyce, a retired Union officer, and his wife Mary had moved to Los Angeles in 1882 in the so-called boom years, when Captain Boyce bred horses and then went on to become the business manager and then owner of the Morning Tribune in his spare time. In addition to the experience of the Civil War, an even deeper and more personal grief had driven the Boyces west. While they lived in Milwaukee before the move to California, 4 of their 5 children had died of diphtheria within 1 week. Mary Boyce must have seemed an exotic figure in the social scene of Los Angeles in those days. Fascinated by the ancient Middle East, she gave her children the names of Egyptian gods and goddesses. Her daughter, Neth Boyce, with her mother's wholehearted support, went on to become a noted New York-based journalist, playwright, and women's rights advocate. In Boyce's salons and study circles, she played host to visiting scholars and writers. In Los Angeles, she hosted Crawford Hancock Toy, eminent professor of Hebrew and Oriental languages at Harvard, and Ernest Fenollosa, the Oriental scholar who nurtured and inspired the Chinese translations of Ezra Pound. An early history of the Ruskin Art Club, written in 1893, describes the club's origins this way. Quote, "A few women, especially impressed by the fine collection of engravings and etchings in the home of Mrs. H. H. Boyce, and desiring a more intimate knowledge of black and white art, engravings, in all its branches, urged Mrs. Boyce to lead a circle or club in the study of this subject. This she consented to do, giving the club free access to the rare books of her library and of superior importance, an opportunity to study the unusually fine collection of masterpieces of old line engravers of different periods." Only recently we have been sent this photograph of that house. So this is actually Mary Boyce's home at 424 South Hill Street in downtown LA, just even a half a block from Pershing Square that we saw earlier at an early incarnation of Pershing Square. I couldn't help trying to discover what is there today at 424 South Hill. It is the Athena parking facility. Many of Mary's friends were not only prominent citizens of boom-era LA, but the spouses of the University of Southern California's founders, the creators of the cultural and educational infrastructure of the emerging city. At the first official meeting of the club, they gave it the name Ruskin. Poignantly, only a month earlier, the master himself, writing in the shadow of Chamonix, put the final touches on the new epilogue to a new edition of his first masterpiece, Modern Painters, and then retired into his long silence. As Mary Boyce writes of this period, the enthusiasm which induced so detailed and prolonged study of the techniques and history of engraving will be understood when the environment of the Ruskin Art Club is considered. Los Angeles, peerless in sunshine and flowers, offers few facilities for the study of art. It has no museums. It has no galleries. Only in the domain of the engraving can access be had to the original works of great artists. In the midst of the high pressure of California life, she's writing in 1893, the Ruskin Art Club has made a place for leisurely and persistent investigation. Given their enthusiasm for the work of American engravers and other regional artists and civic sculptors, the club, as early as 1890, barely 2 years after its founding, had forged ties with the leading American engravers and engraving societies, which resulted in the club bringing over from the Paris exhibition of 1889 the work of prize-winning American engravers exhibited there. In 1890, the Ruskin Art Club mounted a show of these engravings in the Crocker Building downtown, widely considered the first public art exhibition in Los Angeles. These annual art exhibitions, which eventually featured the work of local California painters as well as master wood and line engravings, continued until 1905. The fact that the Ruskin Art Club devoted itself in the first years to a serious study of hand engraving and etching is instructive. There was the public access to art aspect, in which etchings and engravings made great art and design available to a wide public, to persons of modest means. But it went deeper than that. As Gregory Dobie summarizes in an essay on the arts and crafts notion of virtue in design, Ruskin blamed mechanization and its division of labor for subverting workers' participation in the creative process, thereby reducing them to the level of mindless tools in a production line. Censuring the products of machinery as monotonous, uninspiring goods that dissociated their users from contact with human creativity, Ruskin crusaded for hand labor as an essential human right that preserved dignity and inventiveness in society. So early Ruskin Art Club members were not just studying art as a private leisure activity, although there is the lifelong learning aspect to note, but as part of something as large as the expansion or perhaps the recovery of human consciousness itself. Ruskin taught that beauty has an essentially moral, even redemptive function in human life, and that art is one of the principal ways of awakening to the real world, and in the face of industrial abstraction, recovering what it means to be an individual, what it means to be human. Evidence of the civic power of the Ruskin Art Club and other women's clubs in the city was on display in 1909 when the Women's Clubs of Los Angeles obtained a 50-year lease on what is now Exposition Park, converting it in 1913 from a racing track with a well-earned reputation for other vices, such as prostitution, into the site for the Rose Garden and the Museum of History, Science, and Art, the precursor to today's Museum of Science and Industry and the Natural History Museum. A year later, Julia Bracken's Three Graces bronze, its globes supplied by the Judson Studios, was moved from the old City Hall to the museum's main lobby, where after many vicissitudes, it stands again today. Los Angeles was not alone in boasting a Ruskin-oriented club in those days. The end of the 19th century was the heyday on both sides of the Atlantic of Ruskin societies, reading guilds, and associations, to one degree or another, dedicated to studying the works of the Victorian master, following his engagement in arts, education, and applying his insights to the cultural and social issues of the day. The Ruskin Club in Oakland was founded in 1898 by Frederick Irons Bamford, A.A. Dennison, and Austin Lewis, a small group of committed Bay Area socialists. This group had more on its mind than studying art. Modeled after the revolutionary clubs of the French Revolution, they were part of the large and diffuse movement then known as Christian socialism, which attracted progressives bent on radical economic and political reform. Novelist and adventurer Jack London, in his incarnation as revolutionary firebrand, the boy socialist, as he was then called, was a member and frequent star lecturer to the club's intellectual clientele. Architect Bernard Maybeck, pioneer of the Berkeley brown shingle house, as of much else that is distinctive in the Bay Area architecture, may also have had connections with the Ruskin Club, although later, with poet and Ruskin enthusiast Charles Keeler, he founded the Berkeley-based Hillside Club in 1898, which is still in existence, and which served as a mouthpiece for Maybeck's philosophy. The Hillside Club's goal was nothing less than to turn the entire Berkeley community into a woodland garden, according to a 1981 article on Maybeck by Richard Reinhardt, a gentle, park-like encampment of simple homes and winding lanes, pedestrian walks, and flowering stairways. David Judson of Judson Studios, who's with us tonight, called my attention to a book review in the Arroyo Craftsman of October 1909, which references the Ruskin Club of Oakland and gives us a feel for the character of the group. The review relates how the writer Herman Whitaker got his start. Landing in Oakland with a family, a wife and 7 children, but without means, the would-be writer landed a job as a grocery clerk, and he met Jack London, who promptly introduced him to the members of the Ruskin Club. They concluded that the talented grocery clerk with literary ambitions was a giant in the throes of bondage and set out to help him. Quote, at the next meeting, when Whitaker was not there, a man got up and said, "We've got to relieve Whitaker of his bondage. He has power. Let us give him a chance to develop it. I'll stand his grocery bill for a year." In a moment, others leaped at the chance to give help. One pledged shoes, another clothing, and then rent, and so on until the thing was done. Then the club took Whitaker by the scruff of his neck and hauled him forth from his grocery clerking and set him down in his modest home and told him to get to work and to get there. End quote. The Ruskin Club of Los Angeles, the Hillside Club of Berkeley, and then the California Art Club, founded in 1909 by painter William Wendt and his wife, the sculptor Julia Bracken, are the survivors of those heady days and the wildfire movement of Ruskin-inspired associations in California. The Ruskin Club of Oakland disbanded abruptly in 1907, as a London biographer laments, without even winding up its affairs. I discovered recently that there is still a Ruskin Art Club in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that dates to the early years of the 20th century and has managed to soldier on, although more recently I noticed that their website has gone dark, which doesn't bode well. The promise of the West, proclaimed with such drama by the Golden Spike, was to prove, at least in general terms, a disappointment to the large redemptive hopes of the early 20th century California dreamers. As we have seen, redemptive hopes shaped to a more significant degree than is commonly acknowledged by Ruskin and his American followers. Despite the perceptions of 19th and 20th century Anglo-American settlers, the so-called Pullman immigrants, California was not a tabula rasa upon which their dreams could be innocently realized. There were people here, and cultures, and ways of life increasingly pushed to the margins by California's pioneers, even as the newcomers borrowed elements of that local architecture and folkways to create the romantic myth of an innocent Spanish colonial past with mission themes and red tile roofs and wrought iron fixtures, but without Native Americans, Mexicans, and Catholics. Belief in progress, born of the crisis of the Civil War, was to be undermined by an even greater war that broke out in 1914, a conflict that called into question the idealism that had greeted the new century with its apparently limitless possibilities and technological marvels. The dream of Victorian Los Angeles with its Bunker Hill mansions, gardens, and culture building civic engagement had darkened by the 1930s into LA noir, a city of urban exiles, setting of the novels of Raymond Chandler, The World of Chinatown, the corruption-ridden administration of Mayor Shaw, and the architects of megalopolis and urban sprawl. Ruskin speaks to us today for the same reasons that he spoke to our forebears a century ago, but I would argue in a different and deeper, at least more insistent key. Our forebears turned to Ruskin in the face of systemic failure, the failure of a civilization to cohere, symbolized by the Civil War, and therefore with the need to rethink, to re-examine the human enterprise from top to bottom. For that, you need radical thinkers who pose the difficult questions, who challenge the operational assumptions, and who tell you that your choices matter. Ruskin was and is such a thinker. If anything, the systemic and ecological failures of our own time appear far more threatening and urgent than the ones our forebears knew, and may require more radical and wholehearted responses than the ones they envisioned, let alone the ones they managed. In 1884, Ruskin gave an end-of-term lecture to his students at Oxford, during which he expressed a melancholy disappointment in what he saw as their unstated but nevertheless firm resistance to the way of life he had proposed to them. A way of life based not on consumption, on the search for empty leisure, or on the worship of the self, which renders one, Ruskin wrote, an incarnate calamity to the world. All this, said Ruskin of his demands, is called impossible. It may be so. I have nothing to do with its possibility, but only with its indispensability. Thank you.